Welcome back to the Philosophical Inquiry Show. Today we're beginning medieval philosophy. We've finished our lectures on ancient Greek philosophy, those big names, Plato and Aristotle, and now we jump into the next phase of the history of Western philosophy, medieval philosophy. For our purposes, we'll treat medieval philosophy as lasting from 400 AD to about 1400 AD. So, a lot of time has passed since the last lecture. Aristotle died about 320 BC, 320 years before Christ, and now we're jumping to 400 years after Christ. So almost 700 years have passed. Did any philosophy happen in those 700 years? Yeah, of course. Lots and lots of philosophy happened over that period. You've got Stoicism, you've got Roman philosophy, all kinds of things happened. But Plato and Aristotle remained the big looming figures the whole time. And they also remained the looming figures throughout the whole course of medieval philosophy. So you know enough ancient philosophy to understand some medieval philosophy. This is exciting for me because I originally trained as a specialist in medieval philosophy. That's what my early scholarship and research was all about during my graduate studies in the history of philosophy. I still do some work with medieval philosophy, although the focus of my specialization has changed more towards some contemporary issues, but I still maintain expertise and research activities in medieval philosophy. What do you suppose was the biggest change in the world between the death of Aristotle and 400 AD? 400 AD, this is about when the Roman Empire is falling, for those of you who are familiar with European history. What was the biggest other world event between 320 BC and 400 AD? Probably, at least for our purposes, one of the biggest events is the rise of the big monotheistic religions during this period. Christianity comes to be a real force on the world scene, as does Judaism. It really rises into prominence. And also a little bit later, starting a couple hundred years after that, about in the 7th century, Islam starts to rise. And these are the sources of our great medieval thinkers. They all come out of this very Christian or Jewish or Islamic background. And so medieval philosophy is concerned with many issues which today we would call or we would label philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion. The towering intellectual figures of the Middle Ages, when they engaged in philosophy, they were usually concerned with trying to organize the content of their religious beliefs. So in our lectures on medieval philosophy, there's going to be four talks here. The first talk, what I'm going to get into today, is just some overview of the relation between faith and reason in the Middle Ages. Just what do these terms faith and reason amount to? Then, to show you how thinkers concerned with the relation between faith and reason picked up the ancient Greek project, the metaphysical projects begun by people like Plato and Aristotle. I'm going to show how they thought about this in the Middle Ages, because one really cool theory to come out of philosophy in the Middle Ages is the theory of emanationism. So in the next lecture, I'll talk about something called emanationism. You might find it pretty neat. Then, a real cool lecture, probably the biggest, or my favorite of the lectures of medieval philosophy, sure to be some exam questions from the lecture on Thomas Aquinas on God. Many historians would say that Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1275 approximately, many people say he was the greatest of philosophers and theologians to come out of the medieval period. From the Middle Ages, many people say that Aquinas really captures all the greatest parts of medieval philosophy. Not everyone says that, but a lot of people do. He's certainly the most well-known of medieval philosophers, so we'll discuss him. Then the fourth lecture I'll give on medieval philosophy, we're going to look at a number of issues in medieval philosophy, a number of issues that we'll have already discussed, when we discover the tradition that's only really starting to explode in the scholarship over the past few years of medieval women mystics. Nuns NUNS, throughout the Middle Ages, women who were living in convents and monasteries were starting to really discover some of the interesting philosophy that the women were doing, the women mystics in the Middle Ages. So the last lecture on medieval philosophy will be about the tradition, the philosophical tradition that was carried on by the female medieval mystics. But as I said, thinkers in the Middle Ages were very concerned with religious questions. So let's get right down to it. Faith and reason. What do these terms mean? Well, generally, just in a very, very general sense, faith, what we're talking about here, the Latin word fides, faith, has to do with what you accept as true because God said so. Faith has to do with believing something called divine revelation. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all have a robust belief that God has revealed divine truths. Jews in the Middle Ages believed that God had revealed many truths in the Hebrew Scriptures, or what's sometimes today called the Old Testament. Christians agreed with Jews that God revealed many truths in the Old Testament, and Christians believe the fulfillment of those truths came in the person of Jesus Christ and what was written about him in the texts that Christians call the New Testament. And then later on, when Muslims came on the scene, they also had a robust tradition of divine revelation. They believed that the Prophet Muhammad had received the text of the Quran directly from God, well, intermediary through an angel, but I mean it was supposed to be revealed by Allah as something to be revealed as true. Allah, I'm sorry if you don't know, Allah is just another word for God. It was a word in the Arabic and Persian languages used for God. So, people in the Middle Ages, by 400 AD, most of the great intellectual thinkers, a lot of them, the very influential ones, were all contending with religious questions. Well, but there's also the reason. Reason. What's reason? Reason is philosophy. Reason is all the things you might think about or discover independently of divine revelation. Everything you would call scientific research, scientific discoveries, everything which might be discovered just by investigating the world, whether you're investigating it with your senses or with your mind, right? That stuff would all come under the label of reason. It's what reason discovers. Well, people in the Middle Ages were aware that both faith and reason make claims to be the truths that we ought to accept. So, the question for medieval thinkers, and especially medieval believers, was, what ought we to do with these theories of Plato and Aristotle? Now, if you want to know the fascinating stories about how the texts of Plato and Aristotle got handed down throughout the Middle Ages, there's a lot of fascinating details there, but this is not a history class. This is a philosophy class. I'm going to not bore you with details about which medieval thinkers were more familiar or less familiar with different parts of Plato and Aristotle. Suffice it for us to understand that Plato and Aristotle's theories were being talked about throughout the Middle Ages. And of course, Plato and Aristotle, being philosophers, they made claims, or there were claims made about their theories, that this is what it is to love wisdom. Right? The Platonic tradition, which was still alive in the Middle Ages and got handed down as Neoplatonism, as they called it, the Neoplatonists of the Middle Ages. Right? To love wisdom, to study wisdom, to pursue wisdom, is to immerse yourself in Plato's theory of forms, to continue that project of studying the reified essences. Or, on the Aristotelian model, to love wisdom, is to build a scientific picture of the substances of the universe. And then we have a third picture on the table. Plato and Aristotle, of course, there's a little bit of tension between them, right? Aristotle was very critical of Plato. But now we have this third position, which is that you should completely forget the debate about Plato and Aristotle and just study the scriptures. Right? If you're a Jew, you should be studying the Jewish scriptures. Christians study the Christian scriptures, right? If divine revelation is available, this was the problem going into the 400s, into the 5th century. If divine revelation is available, why are we even wasting our time with Plato and Aristotle? If God has told us the important truths that we need to go to heaven, why even waste 1 minute of our lives trying to resolve whether Aristotle's third tree argument against Plato was conclusive or not? Why not just figure out what the scriptures tell us to do, which is something like love your neighbor, do good to one another, and get on with it? This position has a name. It's called fideism. Fideism, from the Latin word fides, for faith. Like fidelity. Fidelity means if you have a great sense of fidelity, you're very faithful. Fideism, faith only. You might think of it as that kind of thing, right? Just trust what the scriptures say. Forget about philosophy. That's fideism. And you can see the straightforward argument for it, right? Why, if it's important, God revealed it. Why worry about anything else? Why worry about what's unimportant? If it were important, God would have provided revelation about it. Well, there you go. Fideism. But not everybody was convinced by fideism. I mean, a great slogan, there's a very famous slogan associated with a guy called Tertullian. The slogan was, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Or what has Jerusalem to do with Athens? Athens is where Plato and Aristotle were doing all their stuff. Jerusalem, of course, is a central place in the Bible for Jews and for Christians. That's where wisdom came from in the Jewish and Christian traditions, was Jerusalem. What has Jerusalem to do with Athens? Asked the fideists. Well, is this the end of the story? No. Many Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thinkers were not at all convinced that fideism was the last word on this. For one thing, why did God even bother creating a universe? Why did God even bother creating a universe if the universe could do nothing except distract and deceive us from God? Now, some of the early medieval Neoplatonists would have been okay with that line of thought. Plato thought that there was a world of forms. That is where we need to direct our attention, right? There's a certain Platonic way of looking at things where indeed the material universe, constantly in flux, constantly changing, as Heraclitus noticed, might be worth nothing other than a distraction from the truth. That's a certain Platonic way of looking at things, right? To get to the truth would actually require you to try to shut out the world of material, changing, fluctuating things. That was a common Neoplatonic way of talking. But early Christian Neoplatonists could not accept that. Why not? Well, for one reason, because God had come to this universe in the form of a human being. Matter was good on the Christian view. The early Christians realized that Plato, for whatever insight Plato may have had, and the early Christians loved to debate whether Plato was right and where he might have been more right than others. I mean, they would just go through Platonic texts trying to figure out, yes, this part of the argument, this is good, we should bring this into Christianity, this part we shouldn't. Even as the fideists were saying, stop doing that. There were Neoplatonic Christians. But one thing that the Neoplatonic Christians realized is that insofar as Plato could be read as suggesting that there's something bad about the material universe, right? The material universe is always decaying. The only thing that's real is the forms that don't decay. Insofar as Plato sought to put down the material, physical world, Plato was wrong on the Christian view. If matter was bad, well, then Jesus should not have come in material form. So there were early Christian Neoplatonists, and one of the well, I'll just say it, the most important Christian Neoplatonist was none other than St. Augustine. St. Augustine dies, if memory serves, you know what, I'll just tell you when Augustine dies. The exact number is slipping my memory. St. Augustine dies in 430 AD, 354 to 430 AD. Augustine is a huge, towering intellect. He was born in North Africa. His mother's name was Monica. She was a Christian. His father was a pagan. Augustine lived as a pagan for the first several decades of his life. His famous autobiography is called The Confessions. You should all read The Confessions at some point in your life. If you come to my office and say, oh yes, I'm a very educated person, I'm very, very classy, I'm going to ask, which translation of Augustine's Confessions did you read? And if you tell me you've never bothered reading Augustine, if you tell me it's not even on your shelf, well, don't talk to me about the books you've read. Go read Augustine's Confessions. Augustine discusses in his autobiography going to college to become a communications major in Rome, and he becomes very influenced by his philosophy teachers and the theories of Plato. But nevertheless, he also likes hooking up with everyone he can, and partying and getting drunk and things like that, and going to the bathhouses. But eventually, as he continued to read Plato, he started to realize that this life of hedonistic pleasures and partying and sex and all that, he started to realize that Plato had something right, that stuff has to be fleeting. That can't be the purpose of life. And after a long journey that Augustine describes in his book, The Confessions, Augustine eventually converts to Christianity. And in fact, eventually, for all his night clubbing, eventually becomes a bishop. Well, Augustine becomes a very prominent Neoplatonist, and he rejects the fideist line on the relation between faith and reason. Instead, Augustine directs our attention to a passage from the Old Testament, the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus, we learn that, if you're not familiar with the story, I'll just fill you in a bit here, that this is a story, the book of Exodus is kind of the Jewish origin story in some ways. How did the Jewish people come to be a nation? It tells us that the Jews used to be enslaved in Egypt. And God came to one of the leaders of the Jewish slaves, Moses, who actually was not quite a slave himself. He had gotten a bit of luck. But God helped Moses lead the Jewish people out of slavery. Moses took the Jewish people, they escaped. God parts the Red Sea for them so that they can walk through the water without getting wet. And when the Egyptian army tries to run after them, God stops parting the sea and they all drown. But the book of Exodus, Augustine notices, tells us one very interesting thing. That as the Jewish people were escaping Egypt, God told them that they could grab the silver and golden idols of the Egyptians. They took all the silver and gold. They also took the necklaces and everything else that the Egyptians had used in their cultic worship of false gods. The Israelites took that, and once they were free and building their own nation, well, now they had silver and gold to make pots and pans and jewelry for themselves and all kinds of other things. The looting of the Egyptians, this is called. So, what has the looting of the Egyptians to do with medieval philosophy? Well, Augustine wrote a famous treatise on the looting of the Egyptians. He said that this is exactly our relationship to the treasures of the Greeks. The Greeks, ignorant of divine revelation, and therefore, Augustine thought, not able to be putting themselves on the true right path, the path that goes to the one true God, nevertheless built beautiful silver and gold ornaments, the systems of Plato and Aristotle, the wonderful philosophical insights of Thales and Heraclitus and Parmenides and so forth. This is the silver and gold that Augustine said was now inherited by contemporary religious thinkers. They could take from the Greeks, just as God told the Jewish people to take the Egyptian silver and gold and use that as the basis for their own new civilization. So, the religious philosophers of the early Middle Ages, Augustine thought, should take the silver and gold of ancient and Greek wisdom, of Plato and Aristotle, and study it and take what's good from it and build the new philosophy from it, the new wisdom. So Augustine finds hope that Jews, Christians, Muslims might synthesize faith and reason. Instead of fideism, faith and reason could go together. Now, how they went together continued to be discussed and debated throughout the Middle Ages. We're not going to get into all the details of that. If you take a course here at Loyola Marymount called Medieval Philosophy, we have a number of professors who teach it regularly. They're all very, very good. I recommend that if you can, you take that course. You might enjoy what you have to learn. Some of us teach courses called Faith and Reason, where we look at some of the medieval authors on these topics. We're not going to get into all those details now. I'm going to instead tell you a little bit about the end of the faith-reason debates in the Middle Ages. What it started to amount to by the 14th century, by the 13th and 14th centuries. They started to talk about God writing two books. And this is still a huge pillar in Catholic and Jesuit education. We talk about things like this here at Loyola Marymount. God writes two books. What are they? Well, there's the scriptures, but also there's creation, the universe. Right? If God created the universe, well, then that's a source to be studied. That's something for us to look at. That's something for us to think about. And so it's actually out of Jewish and Christian philosophical problems in the 14th century, 13th and 14th century, that monks began to really worry about scientific questions. They started to really wonder, for example, if you were to drop objects of different weights, would they fall at the same speed or at a different speed? They knew that if you dropped a feather and an anvil off the side of a mountain, the anvil falls first, but maybe something else was slowing the feather down. So they started to set up experiments. Okay, this, of course, eventually makes the work of Galileo and Newton possible, and the whole Renaissance event that we call the explosion of the scientific revolution. That came out of a late medieval philosophical theory about God writing two books. Okay, said some of these Christian monks, we've now spent over 1,000 years studying the one book, the Bible. Maybe we should start getting equally serious about the other book, creation, studying the universe, looking at what God reveals in created reality. And of course, that's just what philosophers do. Philosophers are trying to organize our beliefs about reality. And so philosophy is really starting to come back on the table away from fideism in the Christian world and also in the Jewish world of the 13th and 14th centuries. God writes two books. Are the two books equal? Are they the same? Not quite. How do they relate to each other? The book of nature, which we study under the heading reason, and which includes philosophy, and the book of divine revelation, which you might call scripture, under the heading faith, all the stuff you would normally study under theology. How do these two domains, these two books, these two ways of organizing our belief systems, how do they relate? And here's the slogan, immensely important in Catholic theology to this very day. Here it comes. Grace builds on nature. Grace builds on nature. Grace, of course, is what's revealed directly from God. Nature is all the creation of God. Grace builds on nature. What's this mean? That means that for us humans, Our place is in the world. Our place is in the created universe. This is where we have to work. This is where we have to live. Whatever God wants to give us will come on top of that. It will come through that. There's nothing other than the material, physical world for us. This is a very Christian idea, but it also gains traction in the Jewish world. That we're biological organisms with a biological way of life, and whatever God reveals to us will be enmeshed within that. Perhaps nobody in the Middle Ages was more concerned with sketching out how faith and reason relate than Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas begins his masterpiece, the Summa Theologiae, with a very straightforward question. Should we think that God revealed anything? Why believe God would have revealed anything at all? And this is, by the way, assuming there is a God. Assuming there is a God. We're going to see in a couple of lectures, Aquinas thinks we have good reason for thinking there's God. But why think God would reveal anything? That the creator of the universe would reveal anything other than the one book, the book of nature? Why think there's something else? Here's Aquinas' answer to that question, and I think it's very clever. Aquinas says this, well, nothing created could possibly satisfy a human desire, the human desire. The human desire is just too great and too limited to be satisfied by any limited thing. You give me anything in the universe, and eventually it's going to fade away, like Heraclitus said. So nothing in the universe can satisfy my desire completely. Only something infinite and uncreated can satisfy that desire, i.e., God. Okay. Now, Aquinas is enough of an optimist to think that if there's something that I'm incomplete without, if there's something that my life is just devastatingly short, absent of, Aquinas thinks that the universe is not so cruel. The universe is not so cruel. Just like the universe would not make grass with sense perception, so that when you stepped on it, it hurts, and it could see the lawnmower coming. Right? The universe is not cruel like that. The universe would not have a creature that has an innate, inborn desire for the infinite, for the uncreated, without any hope of ever achieving that end. So Aquinas says there has to be some hope of achieving our union with God. Now comes the important part of the argument. Aquinas says this, what if we were left to our own devices, namely just philosophy? What if all we had were the towering insights, the profound research, the brilliant work done by people like Plato and Aristotle and their students? What if that was all we had to help us finish the journey? What if that was all we could get to help us on our effort to organize our beliefs about reality? Well, says Aquinas, maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. There's a slight chance that Plato and Aristotle provide a complete picture of everything, including God. But there's a chance they didn't. And even if they did, says Aquinas, even if they did, consider the following. It's really hard to understand Plato and Aristotle. I mean, I've given you in the previous lectures just, the simplest, the beginners, the Plato and Aristotle for first graders kind of stuff, right? You go on to graduate school and you realize, it's like, when you were in second grade learning chemistry, there's quantum physics out there. Understanding philosophy is hard. And some people are just never going to be smart enough to get it. And it takes so much time. I mean, Aquinas, dedicated his life to it. He became a monk. He never got married. He was his whole life, from the time he woke up in the morning to the time he went to bed, his life was structured in such a way to make sure he had enough time every day to work on studying Plato and Aristotle. Not everyone has that kind of time. Some of us get married. Some of us have kids. Some of us have lives. Some of us have jobs. Somebody has to go keep the university running and fix the sinks and things like that. But yet everybody should have some hope of achieving union with God. So if it comes from studying philosophy, well, it's just going to be too hard. It's going to take too much time. And guess what? People sometimes get things wrong, right? There's still a lot of work to be done on the debate between Plato and Aristotle. There's still a lot of questions left to be answered. So, the famous comment from Aquinas was that trying to study these profound mysteries using only philosophy takes much time, much effort and skill, and it comes with much admixture of error. Admixture of error. Yes, you may get a lot right, but you're playing a risky game doing it this way. So, says Aquinas, we should expect God to help us out. We should expect. It's maybe not meant to be a fully conclusive argument. We could go back and forth on whether Aquinas thought this argument was definitive and conclusive or merely probable. Sometimes our arguments are merely probable. But Aquinas certainly thought that we have very good reason to expect God to help us out with some divine revelation. Nevertheless, as we're going to see, Aquinas thinks that philosophy still has an important role to play. Even though we should expect divine revelation, and we should be thankful for divine revelation, because if we're short on time or intellectual skill, or if we happen to make mistakes while we're doing our philosophy, fortunately God gives us some hints to correct our paths and get us back on the right way. Nevertheless, philosophy has a role to play, because God did create the universe. Our ability to even understand divine revelation, thinks Aquinas, requires us all to do just a little bit of philosophy, at least a little bit. We have to think a little bit about the universe first, if we're going to think about God at all. So, what should you take away from this lesson? Well, there's fideism. Is there an argument for fideism? Sure there is. Sure there is. Especially if you think about things from a Platonic perspective. Why waste time studying the transitory, the changing, when there's God and God's revelation immediately available? So make sure you understand a bit about fideism. Make sure you understand what's understood when people talk about God writing 2 books and grace builds on nature. And then see what you can make of the argument from Aquinas that we should expect divine revelation. That there would be something perverse about a creature in the universe such as ourselves with no hope whatsoever. No hope that God might give us some hints on how to satisfy our deepest longings. One last thing. You may have noticed that on some parts of this lecture, I talked about Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Middle Ages. Other times, I just talked about Jews and Christians. Islamic philosophy came to a kind of a different end in the Middle Ages. There are today Islamic philosophers, no doubt about that. But the tradition of medieval philosophy kind of took a pause near the end of the Middle Ages. Why? Because of a guy called Al-Ghazali, who proposed a very interesting theory, and it's a theory that kind of won the day for a while. The theory is called occasionalism. Occasion, you know that word, on the occasion of, all-ism. You want me to put it on the board? Fine, I'll put it on the board. Occasion, all-ism, occasionalism. Here's what Al-Ghazali suggested. You have seen, no doubt, a flame, say on a match or a torch, a flame touched some paper or some thin wood, and then you see the wood go up in flames. No doubt you've seen that. Al-Ghazali had too. Now, Al-Ghazali says, you have probably seen it a number of times, and you probably think, you impious monster, that fire, that the flame, had the ability to make the paper catch on fire. You impious, horrible person, said Al-Ghazali. Why would you think fire has causal ability? Don't you know only God has the ability to create? You think fire creates fire? No, God creates fire. Al-Ghazali suggested this, and this is occasionalism. Yes, it's true that every time the flame has touched paper, the paper went up on fire. Yes, Al-Ghazali says, it's almost certainly true that for the rest of your life it's going to keep doing that. Why? Because God, in God's care for us, has seen to it that it always happens in a predictable way like that. But don't get yourself fooled. Why did the paper go up on fire? Because God made it do that. The flame that touched it had nothing to do with it. Flames don't have causal powers. Nothing, said Al-Ghazali, had causal powers. There's just the universe that's being created and recreated every moment. Every second of your life, said Al-Ghazali, is just another occasion of God's creation. There's no such thing as causation, except for divine causation, said Al-Ghazali. Well, if fire doesn't have the ability to make things go up in flames, and if water doesn't have the ability to make things wet, and if viruses don't have the ability to infect people, and if there's no causal powers in the created order, well, then there's no need for science, is there? And so, in Islam, a version of fideism kind of won the day for a while, the kind of project of philosophy and natural science, which happened to have exploded in the Islamic world way bigger than it did in Judaism and Christianity. By the 10th century, I mean, if you wanted to be in the cities with the best hospitals, the best scholars, the best libraries, you should just hope that you were in a Muslim-dominated city. They were way ahead of everyone else in terms of culture and science and philosophy. But with Al-Ghazali's occasionalism, that started to wind down, and the scientific project really fell into the hands of mostly the Christians, but really the Jewish Christian world by the 14th century. So, there's another way of looking at faith and reason, the theory of occasionalism. Okay, well, hope you've enjoyed this. Let's talk about emanationism. See you, bye.